President Trump announcing a fresh tariff hike on Canada, and it comes after an international spat over Ontario Premier Doug Ford's use of a 1987 Ronald Reagan radio address on tariffs and trade.
Carney says he has a plan.
Building at home, diversifying our trade relationships abroad, and being ready to work with the United States government as and when the time comes.
When President Donald Trump slapped another tariff on Canada, few expected the most powerful response to come in the form of calm. As cameras followed Prime Minister Mark Carney boarding a plane to Asia, he wasn't shouting or retaliating. He simply said that Canada would stay ready to talk when the United States was ready too. In Washington, that quiet tone was almost disarming. Trump had just reignited a feud with Canada after a television ad in Ontario used a 1987 Ronald Reagan speech criticizing tariffs. The American president called it fake, ended trade talks, and added a new round of tariffs. But what was meant to humiliate Ottawa has instead revealed something deeper. Carney's restraint has started to expose the limits of Trump's economic power. The new 10% tariff on Canadian imports halted months of negotiations that were close to producing a steel and aluminum deal benefiting both sides. For many analysts, the move wasn't economic, it was personal. Trump had turned a provincial ad into a political provocation, using his trade authority to punish critics and prove he could still dominate America's allies. Yet, the more he swings that hammer, the weaker it becomes. After nearly a decade of tariff battles, the world has grown used to Trump's volatility. Bloomberg analysts now track each new tariff announcement as a routine event. The same markets that once trembled now simply adjust. Trump's unpredictability, once his greatest weapon, is starting to look like predictability in disguise.
While Trump was reacting to an ad, Carney was redefining the rules of engagement. He told Canadians to focus on what can be controlled, building at home. That message is not passive, it's strategic. Ottawa's 2025 budget commits hundreds of billions to clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and industrial infrastructure. This inward investment has replaced retaliation as Canada's main defense. Provinces like Ontario and Quebec are coordinating to fast-track industrial projects and stabilize supply chains. For foreign investors, that consistency matters. A report by Statistics Canada shows a 14% rise in foreign manufacturing commitments during the first 9 months of 2025, much of it in energy and metals, industries directly hit by U.S. tariffs. Carney's calm, far from weakness, has become a form of economic strength. He is proving that confidence can be louder than confrontation. The breakdown in talks has unexpectedly accelerated Canada's expansion abroad. As Trump closes doors, Ottawa is opening others. Carney's trip to Malaysia for the ASEAN summit marks the start of a larger plan to connect Canadian exports, minerals, technology, and clean energy with Asia's booming economies. Instead of waiting for Washington, Canada is rewriting its playbook. The goal is to anchor its industries to multiple markets, not one. In practical terms, this means securing long-term partnerships in lithium, copper, and renewable components, the same sectors distorted by U.S.-China rivalry. What began as a pause in North American talks is now a structural realignment of Canadian trade strategy. For decades, Canada's prosperity has risen and fallen with America's economic moods. Carney is trying to break that cycle.
Inside the United States, the ripple effects are becoming clear. Farmers and manufacturers, groups central to Trump's political base, are struggling under rising input costs. The National Association of Manufacturers warns that constant tariff shifts are eroding predictability for business operations. Reuters polling in September found support for Trump's trade policy slipping in key farming states, where cross-border exports once sustained local economies. Instead of protecting U.S. jobs, the tariff wars have made planning nearly impossible. The American Chamber of Commerce reported in its September 2025 survey that 62% of mid-sized manufacturers delayed or canceled investment decisions due to trade uncertainty. Each new tariff might win headlines, but it costs confidence, and that's the currency every economy depends on. Meanwhile, Canada's tone of stability has made it a magnet for investors seeking predictability. Trump's America First approach, intended to isolate rivals, is slowly isolating America itself.
Trump and Carney both flew to Asia in October, but for entirely different missions. Trump's meetings revolved around confrontation, China, tariffs, leverage. Carney's focus was cooperation, partnerships, trust, and access. In Kuala Lumpur, ASEAN leaders welcomed Canada's outreach. Japanese and Korean officials described Ottawa as a dependable alternative in uncertain times. Even Beijing, locked in trade battles with Washington, has begun portraying Canada as a stabilizer in global supply chains. Chinese media note that Canada's reliability could offset America's volatility. Whether that perception holds or not, it signals something important. The balance of economic credibility is shifting. A few years ago, the idea of Canada standing as a counterweight to U.S. economic power would have seemed unrealistic. Today, it looks entirely possible. Trump's tariffs were meant to bring manufacturing home and strengthen U.S. leverage. Instead, they are teaching allies how to operate without it. Canada, Japan, South Korea, and the EU are forming new agreements that bypass Washington altogether. The strategy designed to isolate China has gradually isolated the United States. And while Trump's tactics grow louder, Carney's approach grows steadier. His patience has exposed a paradox. The more Washington tries to command loyalty through pressure, the more its partners learn to move independently. The lesson is simple. Power that relies on threats loses value once the threats no longer scare anyone. Carney's restraint has become Canada's strongest weapon, because in this trade war, calm isn't surrender, it's control.
This story began with a commercial and ended as a global turning point. Trump's tariff politics, once a symbol of strength, now reveal the limits of intimidation. Markets no longer fear his tweets. Allies no longer wait for his approval. Carney's response, measured, strategic, quietly confident, has shown that leadership is not about volume but vision. The United States still has enormous influence, but influence without credibility is fragile. In trying to corner Canada, Donald Trump may have cornered America's reputation instead.
President Trump wants to destroy our auto sector, take down our steel sector, go after a manufacturing sector. I'm not just going to sit back and roll over. Everyone in the world wants our critical minerals, and they'll have an opportunity to get those critical minerals.
It began as a quiet trade conference in Toronto, but by midday the mood turned electric. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, speaking virtually from Washington, dropped what Canadian officials later called a bombshell. He declared there would be no free trade deal without tariffs, insisting that Canada must accept being second on autos, and that cars would be assembled in the United States, not in Ontario. Within hours, the reaction rippled across the province. The headlines were blunt: Washington rejects auto deal. In Windsor, auto workers scrolling through the news saw a direct threat to their jobs. In Ottawa, the Prime Minister's office stayed silent, but the tension was clear. Only a day earlier, Prime Minister Mark Carney had met President Donald Trump at the White House, a meeting described as friendly, even optimistic. But that optimism dissolved almost instantly. Across Ontario's factory towns, the question spread fast. What leverage does Canada really have left? The U.S. had just signaled it was ready to shut Canada out of one of its most vital industries. Yet, in doing so, it might have underestimated how deeply its own prosperity depends on the very supply chains it's now trying to break. The message from Washington was not just firm, it was confrontational. Lutnick's statement confirmed what many in the industry feared. The Trump administration wants an industrial hierarchy with America on top and Canada a distant follower. This approach fits Trump's second-term trade strategy. Since early 2025, his government has expanded tariffs across multiple sectors. 25% on Canadian steel, 35% on aluminum, and new duties on heavy trucks and machinery. The White House calls it rebalancing trade. For Canada, it feels like economic warfare. The impact has been immediate. Ontario's auto and parts manufacturers rely heavily on cross-border supply chains that have functioned for decades under the North American trade framework. Each vehicle assembled in Ontario contains parts that cross the U.S. border at least 6 times before completion. When tariffs hit, the costs multiply on both sides. Premier Doug Ford did not hold back. At the same Toronto conference, he warned that if the U.S. destroys Canada's auto and steel sectors, Ontario could halt the flow of critical minerals and cheap hydroelectric energy south of the border. He called it an option he wouldn't want to use, but one that remains on the table. His statement captured a growing frustration that spans party lines. Workers, unions, and industry leaders share the same concern. Canada is being squeezed to accept a lesser role in a system it helped build. But amid the outrage, one truth became clear. Trump's attempt to pressure Canada might be hurting the very U.S. industries he claims to protect. Higher steel and aluminum prices are driving up the cost of American cars. Plants in Michigan and Ohio now face shortages of Canadian materials. The same tariffs meant to secure American jobs are instead putting them at risk. As the rhetoric hardened, Canadian analysts began to refocus on what the country still holds: real leverage. It's not just political goodwill, it's structural power embedded in the North American economy. First, energy. Ontario and Quebec supply significant electricity to neighboring U.S. states, and Canada remains the largest foreign source of U.S. oil and natural gas. American factories run on Canadian energy inputs, often at lower cost than domestic alternatives. If Ottawa or the provinces choose to tighten that flow, the ripple would be immediate across several U.S. states. Second, critical minerals. The U.S. defense and auto industries rely heavily on Canadian nickel, lithium, and cobalt, materials essential for electric vehicle batteries and advanced manufacturing. Nickel from Sudbury, Ontario, and aluminum from Quebec's Saguenay region feed directly into U.S. defense contracts and auto production. Even the Pentagon has acknowledged Canada's importance in maintaining supply security as Washington seeks to reduce dependence on China. Third, the consumer market itself. Canada's population of nearly 40 million buys roughly 2 million vehicles each year, according to Statistics Canada's 2024 report. More than 23% of all U.S.-built vehicles are sold to Canadian consumers. Japan, by comparison, buys only about 1%. Canada isn't just a supplier, it's one of America's biggest customers. This interdependence forms the backbone of Canada's argument. Breaking trade ties doesn't make America stronger, it makes it more fragile. If the U.S. tries to dominate the auto market by isolating its closest partner, it risks losing access to the very consumers and resources that keep its manufacturing engine running. The irony is hard to miss. Trump's tariffs were designed to restore American control, but they are tightening the cost spiral and making North American production less competitive globally. As one Ontario trade official noted privately, every tariff that lands on us lands back on Detroit twice as hard.
But if the President of the United States regards Canada and all that we offer as an enemy and a problem, well, then things will be more expensive and the economy of the United States will be slower.
By the end of the week, what began as an American declaration of dominance had turned into a political reckoning on both sides of the border. In Canada, federal ministers and provincial premiers began coordinating more tightly. Doug Ford and Mark Carney, often at odds domestically, suddenly shared common cause. Both spoke about defending Canadian industries not just through negotiation, but through strategic retaliation if needed.
For Trump, the optics are complicated. His administration projects strength through confrontation, but the economic numbers tell a different story. U.S. manufacturing output slowed through the summer, with the Federal Reserve reporting a 1.8% drop in factory production between June and September 2025, the steepest decline since early 2023. The very tariffs meant to protect U.S. industry are now feeding inflation and cutting profits. Meanwhile, Canada's measured patience, seen by some as weakness, is starting to look like resilience. Instead of retaliating wildly, Ottawa is working sector by sector, protecting steel and aluminum through provincial cooperation, securing energy exports with new long-term buyers in Europe, and keeping its critical mineral strategy aligned with allies like Japan and South Korea. In this new trade landscape, leverage is not about loud declarations, it's about quiet interdependence. Every factory in Michigan that needs Ontario steel, every automaker that depends on Canadian nickel, every American household that drives a car built with Canadian aluminum, those are the ties that limit how far Trump's trade aggression can go. The balance of power has shifted. The bombshell that was meant to shake Canada may have instead exposed America's own vulnerabilities. When a superpower tries to dominate its neighbor, it risks unraveling the shared system that made both prosperous. As Ontario's factories hum under uncertainty and Washington doubles down on pressure, one lesson stands out. Power in trade is not only about who shouts louder, but about who can afford to stay calm when the other side starts breaking its own rules. And right now, Canada's calm may be the most powerful move of all.